Hey folks, it's Nate. Thanks for joining me at the art table again today. Sometimes I run into a book that I kind of want to talk about, but it's hard to find exactly what there is to say about it. One such book is Boobs of Steel by J. Ishiro Finney. And no, this is not just horny posting. This is an actual discussion of an independently published book that I read recently and is pretty interesting. Longtime followers of the culture war know that looking back, one of the first signs of the impending cultural collapse was the attempt to remove everything that made female characters distinct from male characters. In the olden days, strong female characters exerted themselves and defined themselves with a number of characteristics that were distinct and separate from strong male characters. They had their own set of trademarks, they had their own set of goals and objectives, they had their own way at looking at the world and the nature of power. To go with that, there was a set of tropes, iconography, and stereotypical depictions that helped these archetypes make themselves known very quickly. According to TV tropes, the Boobs of Steel trope signifies the tendency of the strongest female fighter in a group also having the largest breasts. This is a trope that has been on the wane as of late. Boobs of Steel is an attempt to recount the history of this trope, what it symbolizes beyond combat prowess, and renew appreciation in how it was used beyond the obvious aesthetic value of it. Now, Mr. Finney has done a lot, and I do mean a lot of research into this trope. He discusses it in the East and in the West. He discusses it in ancient myth and in 20th century pulps and film. He discusses it in classic Wonder Woman comics and in the modern run of America Chavez. Well, he certainly discusses America Chavez. How much the Boobs of Steel trope has to do with this, I'll leave to you to read in the book. There are a lot of issues in talking about this book. The first and biggest one is that it is a work of nonfiction. An entertaining work of nonfiction, to be sure, but a work of nonfiction. Much of the material discussed here, I'm really not qualified to comment on. I'm not very familiar with Wonder Woman's early run, or with the America Chavez character at all. Of the manga and anime discussed in the Japan section, I'm really only familiar with Bubblegum Crisis. And that's saying something. I've watched a fair bit of anime and certainly read a lot of manga, but this is some serious old taku stuff in here. So while I was very entertained reading this book, and I found the breadth of commentary that Ishiro manages to put into his book very interesting, in order to really review this book as a work of nonfiction, I think I would have to be able to comment on its accuracy, at least to some extent. And that would probably take me at least a year of research to do. By the same token, discussing a trope is very difficult. The definition of a trope is a moving target, much like the definition of a word, only more so. TV tropes notwithstanding, there is no recognized central authority where you can go and find the definition of a trope, complete with examples used in sentences or in media. Yes, TV tropes attempts to do this, but it's not really based on any kind of serious linguistic study, the way an actual linguistic dictionary might be. Nor is there any attempt, it seems, to keep TV tropes up to date with the current usage of a word. You may consider that a positive, but nonetheless, it does present a difficulty in discussing tropes. Nevertheless, like most labels, the real question I have with a trope is how useful it is. I think Finney makes a really good case for the usefulness of the Boobs of Steel trope in his book. That said, it is a pretty narrow trope, and I understand that most people, well, they may not be that interested in the history, evolution, and subversion of a specific trope. I mean, I know I mostly talk about geek subjects here, but this is some really geeky stuff, guys. And I don't just mean the kinds of stories that Finney talks about. Sure, he talks about comics and anime, but he also talks about pulps and old movies, both of which were very mainstream in their heyday. I'm not sure that we get mainstream movies anymore outside of Marvel and the occasional Tom Cruise blockbuster, but it is what it is. They were mainstream once. I think it's really pretty cool that Finney has made this work of independent scholarship and published it himself. People looking to understand how depictions of characters got where they are, or who, like myself, are very interested in the great arc of narrative that has led from ancient myths to where we are now today are really going to enjoy this book. However, there is a second part to this book which we haven't seen yet. And I presume, based on what I've read so far, that in this Finney is actually going to talk about the deconstruction and reconstruction of this trope. And by deconstruction, I mean the way that Hollywood and comics and most other mainstream forms of entertainment have worked to undermine this trope and deliberately take it out of the stories they tell. Reconstruction-wise, I expect Finney to kind of future cast a way that this trope could be worked back in and we could have it continue doing the kind of work it has done in the past. That part of the story does not exist yet. I think once it does, I'll have a clearer idea whether I can recommend this to storytellers who are looking to craft the kinds of adventure and fantasy stories that tend to have Amazons in them. Based on what I've seen so far, I expect that I can, but I haven't actually seen the product yet, so I'm going to withhold judgment there, just in the name of prudence. What is less clear to me is whether this book has a broad appeal. No, not that kind of broad. Again, I really enjoyed this book, even though I don't know very much about the characters and stories and franchises that Finney discusses. However, I'm not sure big fans of Wonder Woman or Power Girl or any of the other characters described in this book will resonate to a work that looks at them specifically through the lens of a single trope. Most fans of a character are fans of the character as a whole, as opposed to single aspects of them. Now, I know there are specific aspects and tropes people grab onto, and I have definitely heard from many women of considerable bust size that seeing busty, heroic characters in stories made them feel more confident about themselves as they were growing up, when initially they just felt awkward and exposed by their coming of age. Will that kind of love for those stories translate to an interest in the tropes and building blocks that made those stories? Well, as a person who has always been a fan of adventure and fantasy stories, who has enjoyed looking at the stages of characters' journeys through those stories, and has frequently tried to discuss them with other people, I can frankly say, not often. That said, this is still a great book for the people who do want that. And if what I've described to you is you, definitely give this book a look. Even if you're a woman who has never needed a busty take-charge heroine to feel good about themselves, I think you'll appreciate what this book has to say about the archetype. Provided, as always, that is something that you really enjoy. But those are just my thoughts about the book. If you've read it, let me know what you think down in the comments below. If you haven't read it, I have included a link to the Amazon page for the book, and you can give it a look if it's something you'd be interested in. There's also a like button and a subscribe button down there. You can use those as you see fit, and I'll talk to you all later.